How's it going, YouTube? Coming to today's another video, and today what to bring to you is going to be the side guide, and I really do hope that you enjoyed today's video because today we're going to be going in depth about how to sideboard and exactly for which event you're sideboarding for, what decks really look for in their sideboard, and much more. So if you haven't already checked out my sponsors over at Imperium Duels, Dragonshield, Gem, Cloud, RW, Grimoire, definitely go ahead and check them all out down below in the description. Follow my Twitch, Twitter, and subscribe to the channel. I hope that you all enjoy, and let's hop right into the video. Before we do though, just make sure that if you are on TCGPlayer, you are using my link down below. It costs nothing to you and only benefits the channel. With the sideboard, most games are played post-side. Your side's very important. So if you're expecting to be going into Game 3 in certain matchups, this is one thing where you are playing Game 2 and Game 3 with your sideboard, which can be very impactful. I know my first regional top that I ever had, I ended up having to reverse to almost every opponent I had because my Game 1 was pretty unfavorable. But my sideboard was fantastic, and it really did help me out. So that's one thing where when you are losing Game 1, you have to have faith that you actually did a correct sideboard, because if your sideboard is good, you have a fantastic chance of coming right back into that game and doing exceedingly well. Now, some sides will vary based off of need. So let's say that your deck is just like screaming that it needs like a call by or a cross out for things like D-Shifter or Lancia. Now, your side might look a little different because you have to force in 3 cross out and like a Lancia or a D-Shifter in your sideboard just so you can play the game in certain scenarios. So that's where sideboarding can get a little bit complex, and we'll go into a very beginner guide and then talk about how you can be a little bit more advanced with your siding. Now, in a lot of my videos, I usually talk about siding in this pattern, 6, 6, and 3. Now, since then, I've really had a deep thought into siding, and it does go a lot deeper than just this, but this is a very beginner look at siding if this is something that you want to start up into and really trying to learn theory and how to side. This is a really good pattern for you to really understand what siding means before you get into deep theory behind siding. Now, this is a side breakdown for a very beginner sideboard. It's going to be 6 going first cards, 6 going second cards, and 3 utility cards. Now, you will learn that there's a lot of variance to this, because sometimes if you are going into a sideboard scenario, you want to make sure that you're not going to overside, but you're not going to underside. So usually the magic number is 6. You just want to side in 6 cards, and you don't want to side anything over or under, because if you side too many, you're risking seeing all sideboard. If you side in too few, then you're risking seeing no sideboard, and that's very scary as well. So 6 has always been the magic number, but when do you break that number? And usually it's whenever you have so many dead cards in your deck that they just don't do anything to the matchup. So if you really need to make sure that you're having an efficient Game 2 and Game 3, sometimes you have to take out like 10. If you have that many dead cards and you want to make sure that you're good to go when you're going into your Game 2 and 3, whichever you think that you're going first or second, you want to make sure that your side's adequate and that you're going to draw a really good hand. Now, this is where this is really helpful, because you have 6 cards that you're just like, oh, these are for going first. You have 6 cards that you're like, oh, these are for going second. You have 3 utility cards that I really like, because the utility part of it really means that they're good for going first or second. Cards like Droplet, cards like Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse, these cards that will really help you out in multiple scenarios. So if you don't know if you're going first or second, you can usually lean on the utility card to really be there for you. Now, what happens when you can only side in 3 cards in your sideboard because you're like, none of these really do anything except this one card? Well, look at your main deck. A lot of times you can only side in 3 cards because your main deck's already catered for the matchup, and that's okay. If you already have like Ash, Nib, Imperm, Ogre, like all these cards that are like really good for the matchup, and then you can only side in like Bell, that's fine, because your deck already has multiple cards. Like Nib sometimes winds up in the sideboard, so right now you're maining it, and then you already have a card that's a good counter for that matchup, so now you're just siding in Bell to be able to help you out more. So never be afraid to just side in 3 cards if that's all you can do, because you also just don't want to miss side and then side too many things or things that are like inadequate. Quick story for you, I was at a YCS and my opponent was on Marincess. I was on Cash when it first came out. In Game 2, my opponent went to go overlay 2 level 4 Marincess, and then they ended up going for a Link instead. So going into game 3, when I knew I was going second, I kept in Lava Golem because in my head I was like, they're gonna go for a Kraken line, and they went Argonaut Kraken, and then my first card I drew off the top of my deck was Lava Golem, and then I threw lava on the board, and they're like, why did you keep that in? And I was like, because I just knew you were gonna go for this. Like, you have to pay attention to your opponent the entire time because it helps with your siding. Little things like them motioning for an X-Seed tells me they're playing Kraken. If I just let them go off, they're going to go Argonaut Kraken. So that's a big thing that can really give you a huge advantage into your matchups, especially post side. Now, each room will vary. So you have locals, regionals, and YCSs. Each one of these are very distinct in their own regard as far as sideboarding. Now, for locals, you have very targeted siding. Let's say that you have a lab player at locals, you see them walk in, you're like, oh, Denko Seka's going to my side because it's before the tournament, so it's perfectly fine. And now you're playing the whole tournament with Denko Seka because you know there's lab in the room. If you know your local scene, you have a Cosmo player, you have a tier player, you have all these other decks that are very graveyard reliant, right? You're like, alright, I'm just going to be putting in Dweller in my extra deck. That's definitely something that locals is very keen of. If you know there's a lot of flu, you're putting in your Lancias, you're putting in your Drolls to your sideboard, right? And then it doesn't really follow a rhyme or a reason. Like, you shouldn't assume that you know what people are on because, especially at locals, people can just switch decks like crazy between locals, right? So they go to like one local, they're playing Plunder, they go to the next local, they're playing Kashtira, and it really does depend on what they choose to bring. But if you think that they're going to be on something, you're like, all right, cool, I'm just going to change my sideboard for what I want it to be for today. And, you know, that's something that we see quite often. But with regionals, it's a bit different. And the number one thing I can tell you about regionals is you need to focus your sideboard for rounds 5 to 9. Stop worrying about 1 to 4, and I promise you that is where you're going wrong. You are like, what if I play against the Mermail deck? What if I play against Mermail? What do I do? I get my hand ripped and I lose. It's gonna suck. I don't want to be there because I'm gonna lose. The Mermail player is gonna get me. Mermail's not real. Like, it's very fake good. It's not that good at all. And realistically, you're going to play against 0 to 1 Mermail player the entire regional. If you run into it rounds 1 to 4, you got to deal with it, right? That way you have things like Ash, Impulse, cards that are already going to be generically good into it. Or even like Droll's not that bad. So that's one thing where you cannot focus on rounds 1 to 4 where you're like, oh my god, what if I play against this deck that's like really obscure and like no one's actually going to be playing it, and if they are, it's only going to be like 0 to 1. You need to break that mindset because it'll get you so bad. You need to focus your side for rounds 5 to 9 when you're playing against Ryziel, Malice, Ryziel. So that's one thing where when you start really picking up speed and you're getting to the later rounds and people are playing the decks that you built your deck for and your side for, you start winning a lot more of those games because rounds 1 to 4 should be easy. And hypothetically, you might play against the round 5 to 9 opponents at 1 to 4, but odds are you won't. So that's one thing where you want to just gas through 1 to 4 and then start beating down 5 to 9, and that's how you top regionals. That being said, make sure you can handle Rogue. Rogue is the #1 killer of records at regionals. Just make sure that you can handle the Rogue decks. Know what they do. Literally sit on EDO Pro for like 2 hours. You'll play against Ancient Gear, Marincess, Ryugi. You'll play against all these really bad decks, right? And that's one thing where you kind of want that experience because if you play against them, you're like, oh, this is easy. I know what to do. And it's not that bad. Now for a YCS, we're talking business. Rounds 1 to 3 could be Rogue. You could just have an all meta experience. I've had these before at YCSs where I literally sat down from round 1 to round 9 and it's all Snake Eye. Snake Eye, Snake Eye, Snake Eye, Snake Eye. Like, just every single round. And YCSs, you have to be prepared for rounds 4 to 11 or 12, dependent on attendance. But more importantly, you kind of want to make your side more targeted toward the top 3 decks. So like Ryziel, Malice, maybe some kind of like Snake variant, or if you're worried about the Fiendsmith Cash deck, these are things that you really have to build your deck for to make sure that you're not going to get blindsided by these. And Rogue will be there, but it's not going to be super prevalent. So that's one thing where you really want to make sure that you are ready to go when it comes to playing against the better decks in the room. Because a lot of people who travel to a YCS, they are there to win. And that is one thing that you're going to find a lot of. So bring your A game, make sure your side's ready for 4 to 11 or 12, and then also aim toward the top 3 decks in the room. Avoid siding out engine. A lot of people do this and it drives me insane. If you have engine cards, make sure you're not siding them out for non-engine. Usually you want to side out non-engine for non-engine. If you're in a spot where you're going first, consider siding out like a copy of Imperium, a copy of Valor, a copy of Nib, a copy of Ash. Just make sure that your third copies are coming out and being substituted in for other non-engine, because you're probably in your head like, oh, it would suck to get rid of these hand traps, but you also have to realize that those hand traps are now like Anti-Spell and like other really solid cards that you're gonna want going first. Or even going second, if you think that certain cards in your deck aren't that good, or if you take out like a third copy of Allure, if you take out a third copy of a Valor. These are things where like Valor is still very good, but you want to make sure that you are putting in cards going second that are even just as good as a Valor, like an Ultimate Slayer, right? And another thing too is like if you're playing a pot card and you have 3 of it, like Desires, usually going second you take out the third Desires because you don't want to draw your double Desires, and you definitely don't want to Desires into Desires. So bringing out the third copy usually works out very well, whereas if you start siding out engine, you're gonna brick. Having the 16th extra deck slot can be very helpful. It also can suck, especially when time's coming up. It takes forever to be able to put one of these into your extra deck, and it's just something that is very telegraphed too, and it's not always very great to have this as an option. I think it's fine sometimes to have the 16th extra deck slot, but try to avoid this as much as possible because it's just not efficient. So here's an example of a side in my striker deck, and I do have 6 utility cards with the Book of Moons and the Impulses. Going first, I do have, it looks like, 8 traps between the DDG, the D-Barriers, and the Trap Tricks. And of course, you can put in the Book of Moons or the Impulses if you want. And then going second, I also have Impulsive, Book of Moon, and the Jamming Waves. So you really want to make sure that your side cards are for matchups that you know what they're there for. So if you're siding a card and you're like, I don't really know what this is for, why is it in your sideboard? It shouldn't be there. You should only make sure that you're playing the cards that you know why they're there. Every card should have a reason in your deck list. And if you can't find a good reason for why it's there, maybe it's time to substitute something else in and give it a better recent play, right? I do hope that you enjoyed today's video. There's a lot of thought that goes in these videos because I really want to help out those who don't understand how the higher levels of things like siding go, and it can get really complicated. It can get really confusing, but I'm here to try to make that a little easier. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel so we can hit our goal at 30,000, and I really do hope that you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.